Welcome back. Today we will update our series on meditation. And this talk is a little more comprehensive and in-depth compared to the things we have done in the past. Meditation has experienced a boom in the context of the mindfulness movement, which has swept the United States and much of Western Europe as well. However, as it turns out, we have been missing the boat in many respects in misinterpreting the original power and indication for mindfulness training and particularly meditation as transmitted to us from ancient sources such as the Buddha 2,500 years ago. The other criticism is that the studies that have been done thus far are often very deficient. Frequently, they are cross-sectional. You fly in so many Buddhist practitioners from Tibet, you create a control group if you get lucky, and then you do a comparison, but you do not really know what the trajectory of the training of the mind-brain is that produces the changes in the brain that we are so interested in. So today we focus on a study here from Germany, namely the Max Planck Gesellschaft or Max Planck organization, which runs a number of Max Planck institutes in Germany. Now this one comes from Leipzig, from the Max Planck Institute for Social Psychology, and the key person here is Tanja Singer. She is the leading author here, and she is the driving force behind the social psychology movement and the study of mindfulness. So let's drive right ahead and let's remind ourselves where all this started. So here we have a statue of the Buddha. You see the serenity, the calmness, the lotus position, the attention drawn inward, and the focus on the activities of the mind and the detailed study of the mind. And here you see that in India, there is still meditation, of course, going on. Here's a gentleman sitting by a river, perhaps the Ganges, and meditating, and you can see the similar erect spine and inward direction of attention that you see in the statue of the Buddha depicted on the left. So what is mindfulness actually? How do we define this word? Many people mean different things. So the most famous definition is from Jon Kabat-Zinn, namely, the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally for the unfolding of experience. So there's quite a bit in here, namely, paying attention on purpose. So there is a volitional focusing component, and non-judgmentally, in other words, non-critically, accepting what is going on, focusing on observing rather than criticizing, and following the unfolding of the experience of the mind. So that is the classical Jon Kabat-Zinn definition. And here in the next slide you see John now here, and he is a famous, world famous really, meditation teacher. All this began in 1979 at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, where Dr. Zinn was involved in treating patients, particularly patients that were in advanced stages of disease, that had cancer, perhaps terminal diseases, and often suffered from significant pain. Now, he had a experience in one of his own meditation retreats where he was sitting in the lotus position, and he noticed that his spine became painful and his knees hurt like hell. But after a while, he stepped back from his pain, from the immediacy of the pain, and just observed the pain. And what he found was that the pain was still there, but it didn't matter as much. It was an object of observation, non-judgmental observation, the unfolding of the mind. And from that key experience of his own inner mind, he developed a program of mindfulness-based stress reduction. And he has trained literally hundreds of therapists in this modality, And this technique is used all over the world in hospitals and clinics and so on and so forth. So that was in 1979. Now the antecedents of this entire movement go back a little further. There is a gentleman by the name of Dan Goleman who wrote a book a while back called Emotional Intelligence, which you may have heard of. And then there is Richie Davidson. Everybody calls him Richie. Richie got involved with the Dalai Lama and the Mind and Life Institute. He is now running a major research center at the University of Wisconsin, studying mindfulness and emotional control and other aspects of the mind-brain at his institute, and he is now a worldwide acknowledged researcher in this field. Now, both Dan Goleman and Richie Davidson met at Harvard as undergraduates and wound up somehow in India to visit gurus and to satisfy their thirst for spiritual quest and illumination. And it's that antecedents, those early seeds, that 50 years later almost have now resulted in this movement of mindfulness investigation. So here you see what the data looks like. In 1970, the first paper ever published here, just about here, was by Dan Goleman. And it was a very poor paper. There were no control groups. The instruments, the approaches were very indirect, namely EEG recordings. There was no CT scanning, and there was no MRI and all these fancy technologies that we use now. But then somewhere in 2003 or 4, just around here, there is an inflection point. That is the year when Richie Davidson published a paper on the changes in the brain of very experienced meditation adepts from Tibet that were flown into his lab. And this, of course, was done in collaboration with the Dalai Lama. And you can see now that the number of publications is increasing exponentially. So right now, about 1,103 publications were published in 2016 alone. And it's very difficult to separate the good publications and the not so good publications, because the data is only as good as the design of the experiment. And there's a lot of sloppy design that has been used in the past, and it has muddied the field and clouded the data. And what this talk is about, and a subsequent talk that we will give, is to separate the wheat from the chaff and find out what is valuable and why. So here's a book that Dan Goleman and Richie Davidson published just very recently, and we will do a book review on this shortly, which we will publish on Behavioral Health 2000. And that is a review of everything that has been done since 1970 or so until 2016. And what has emerged is that, for example, of original 231 reports on cultivating a so-called loving kindness or compassion meditation, only 37 of those studies really met criteria in terms of top scientific design. And if you look a little deeper, only really 8 of these papers were really totally kosher in terms of the science and the design of the experiment. So this gives you an indication how little excellent science there is in the meditation field and how much questionable data are floating around. Now, the other part that we should mention at this time is this. We use meditation or mindfulness as a technology. It's very popular in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, where people want to enhance their capacity for concentration, staying up longer hours, writing code more efficiently. The happiness movement is involved in this. So we use meditation as a tool to train our mind in a very specific and limited way. That is not what meditation originally was used for. It was used for a much broader context of exploration of the structure of the human mind, of the delusions or illusions that we are subject to, and to learn how the world operates in reality rather than as perceived by our mind. And all those aspects are usually not addressed in meditation literature as it is published and talked about, especially in self-help books at this particular time. The other aspect is, rather than enhancing the ego by getting further tools of concentrations or power of concentrations, the original idea was to deconstruct the ego, or find out that the so-called self is really a composite which is created by the brain on an ongoing basis, and that your self that you have today is not the self that you will wake up tomorrow after a good night's sleep. Now let's delve a little further now into our study. So this is what the group in Germany did. They did a monumental study. They developed the so-called resource project. It's a unique one-year program blending Eastern and Western methods of mental training. Now, in the paper, they go through great lengths in stating that they have stripped their technology, their approach, totally of any religious types of connotation. However, if you read the resource book, the e-book, which is available to you in the presentation page that is accompanying this lecture, if you read carefully, you see references all over the place to original Buddhist thinking. So the idea of the religious stripping is really not quite accurate. But you can make the case that the original Buddhist impulse was not really a religious one, but rather a psychological one, namely, to investigate the workings of the mind, the delusions and illusions that we are subject to, and find out how those illusions and delusions make us unhappy and cause suffering. So then, the idea here is to look at folks that come into the study from the street. These are not meditators. They're enrolled into a long-term protocol, and along the way, the researchers measure their MRI to determine the cortical thickness in various brain areas, because it is known that if you train certain cortical functions such as navigational skills, there's a famous case of London taxi drivers which have enhanced volume in the hippocampal areas, violinists which use fine motor skills in the left hand to the nth degree often have an increased cortical volume in the corresponding motor strip, and other examples abound. So then this group set out to do three different things. Number one, focus on attention. Attention, of course, is the foundation of all meditation. You need to settle the mind, calm it down, so you can then attend to that topic or that field of investigation that you really want to focus in. Interoception is really a subpart of attention, namely scanning the body and being aware of the different sensory impulses that arise from your body. Remember Richie Davidson having the, Kabat-Zinn having the experience of having pain in the lotus position in his back and in his knees. He paid attention to those things and was able to make the pain a topic of investigation rather than a topic of distress. So here we have then attention and interoception. The second major topic that the Leipzig group was interested in was socio-affective skills, namely compassion and empathy. Compassion and empathy are two different things. Empathic responses is feeling somebody else's pain, and you can be traumatized by feeling somebody else's pain, whereas compassion is an open awareness of somebody's suffering, but with a purpose, with the goal of finding ways to alleviate the suffering. And that component, the intentional component of alleviating suffering, protects you from the straight empathic response that goes straight to your heart like an arrow and makes you suffer along with your subject. Now, the third component is a socio-cognitive component, namely, can you take the perspective of another person in viewing certain ideas or discussing certain ideas? So this, of course, requires you to have a sense of yourself, your own cognitive patterns, putting those aside and walking a mile in the shoe of somebody else. So that's called perspective taken on self and metacognition. So these are the three major themes. And then the hypothesis is that these three items should enhance cortical thickness in different brain areas, namely those that we know already are involved in these particular affective and cognitive skills. So the group then made predictions, namely, the first module, they call it presence, attention basically, focusing attention on the current moment. So very much like the Kabat-Zinn definition of being here and now and paying attention in a non-judgmental way. And it is known that there is an attention network in the brain composed of prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, some parietal cortical areas, and the anterior insula, which is the interoceptive region where you process signals coming from your body. That is the area that John Kabat-Zinn was utilizing when he was tuning into his pain. Then there are predictions, of course, for the other modules, the socio-cognitive or perspective module, and that should involve the theory of mind network, TOM. We know that medial prefrontal cortices, the precuneus, and the very famous temporal parietal junction, or TPJ, are critically involved in cognitive, socio-cognitive task. And finally, we have an affect module, and you could have guessed that the anterior insula, of course, is very important because you relate in part by invoking the same network that people invoke when they have emotions in your own brain, the anterior cingulate cortex and the lateral prefrontal cortex. So you can see this is a fine-grained, anatomically subdivided analysis of increase in cortical thickness, invoking the idea of neuronal plasticity. If you train a function, then this training will increase that cortical area which mediates that function. So here is then a quick anatomical overview over these different areas. So let's start with perspective taking. We talked about the temporal parietal junction right here, and the precuneus are involved in a major way, as well as some areas of the medial prefrontal cortex. So presence invokes anterior frontal areas, dorsolateral frontal cortex right here, and the anterior cingulate gyrus, whereas affective things are processed here in the more orbital frontal cortex and the anterior insula. So you get this idea that you can break down the anatomical location that you're trying to train and enhance by what you are asking your subject to focus on and the techniques that you teach your subject. So here then is this gigantic study. So we have genes and we have the environment. Then the folks come into training, and this training goes on for months and months and months. It's 9 months of training. It's very extensive. We will look at that in just a second. Now, then we believe that brain plasticity will come into play because you're training cortical areas. And then you go ahead and measure subjective well-being, you measure health outcome and behavior, and of course you measure in the MRI scanner the cortical thickness, which is the proof in the pudding that in fact neuronal plasticity has been utilized by the subject to enhance those meditative and attentional skills. So here's another way of breaking this down. We have the attention module, the perspective taking module, and the care compassion module, empathy and compassion. So all subjects were trained in all three modules. Now, attention can easily be measured by the fact that the mind tends to wander. And when the mind wanders about, you can bring the mind back, and that is a measure of the work that you do in training the mind to sustain attention in a more prolonged fashion. And I already pointed out that anterior frontal areas are mostly involved in this task, associated also with anterior cingulate cortex. Now, interoception, we talked about, involves the insula. And here are a number of slides which are drawn from the ebook, the resource book that Tanya Singers has provided for their subjects, and explaining in great detail what the rationale was of the study. And we will breeze right through here because you can read those at your leisure. We already went over this. Now here is a detailed map of what these folks were asked to do. So on a typical day, they would start with a meditation session, then they had a feedback session, then they had a so-called contemplative dialogue, a break, a motivational talk, meditation, silence, organization, and so on and so forth. A very detailed and structured training module that all these subjects had to go through for 9 months on a stretch. So breathing meditation, of course, is the classical beginner's meditation to focus attention, and that's how they started. Body scan also is a focusing device. You go from toe to your head, paying attention to all sensations and feelings that come from your body, head to toe. And that is a way to focus your attention on the here and now and you. Loving kindness meditation is a meditation in which you focus on wishing others well, usually starting with somebody very close to you, perhaps a spouse, a child, parents, and then extending into friends, co-workers perhaps, and then humanity as a whole perhaps. And as it turns out, this focusing on the well-being of others while you're in the meditative state is a very powerful way of changing your own well-being as well as circuits in the brain. Now, the new wrinkle that I had not heard of is the so-called affective dyad. These are two people meditating together. They face each other, look at into each other's eyes. A person will make a statement, and the compatriot would talk about that statement, give feedback, respond in some empathic way, while the two people are connected in this dyad, in an interpersonal, empathic, and intimate connection. So this is the real world test, how does this play out in everyday life, not just when you sit on the meditation pillow by yourself, but when you interact with other people. And here's a summary of what this looks like. So we have a control group, people who do not have any of this training, but get scanned repeatedly. We have a group that only received the affective module, and here we have the two main groups that started with the present module, and then in different order, either the affective module or the perspective taking module, kind of a counterbalanced sequence, and then look at the result after a period of about 9 months. Now, this study is a bear of a study because the report that we talk about today is just an initial peak. They are collecting plasma levels of immune indicators, oxytocin level, oxytocin being a hormone that is involved in trust, telomere length. Telomeres are those structures in your chromosomes that determine how long the cell will live. And if telomeres shorten rather quickly, the cell will become senescent and die. And telomere length is an indicator perhaps of your own life expectancy or how many healthy years you may have left. The arginine vasopressin receptor genes, serotonin transporter genes, opiate receptor genes, etc. Calcium channel genes, a gene for the nicotine acetylcholine receptor, etc., etc., the cannabinoid receptor. So all these things will eventually be published. Is there a relationship between polymorphism in these genes to the performance of these subjects in meditation and their ability to tap into neuroplasticity? So we can anticipate publications from this group for many months to come. So we talked about compassion and empathy before. You can see, you can dissociate the networks in the brain that are related to empathy alone. We already talked about the anterior insula, that area of the brain where you perceive your own physical sensations and that allows you to imagine how somebody else feels who is in pain, for example. And here the compassion network, which has more anterior structures like the medial prefrontal cortex, which are designed to respond to suffering, but with the intent of alleviating the suffering, listening and experiencing the suffering in a structure that allows you to use the information transmitted to you to come up with possible solution of alleviating the pain. And here are some results of the empathy and compassion training. This is from previous publications out of Dr. Singer's lab. So she didn't make this up out of whole cloth. She has a number of years of experience in this kind of brain mapping. So here is again the training module, and here the findings begin. So what happens if you're in a control group? You come to the center, you have your brain scanned, but you're not being trained in any of these meditation modalities. And what happens is your cortex is shrinking. Now that's not because you are a part of the study, but it's because you have grown 9 months older while the other folks are enrolled in the protocol and you are a bystander. And you can see here there's a decrease in cortical thickness. And this is a well-known effect that with age, cortical thickness decreases progressively. Not good news for us, unless, of course, you tap into your own ability to use the ability of neurons to get activated by stimulating them with appropriate tasks. And that is what we see here. So you can see that different regions increase their cortical thickness in response to affective training, and different regions are increasing thickness in response to attentional training. So this slide alone here is the proof in the pudding, because all these subjects started from ground zero. They were volunteers. They had never meditated before. What we're looking at here is the evolution of neuronal plasticity brought about the training module that the group in Leipzig has developed. In other words, if you do this training, you will increase cortical thickness according to what kind of exercises, what kind of training you are engaged in. You can see here that in the control group you have decreases in cortical thickness in various areas, whereas in the group that had first the affective training, you see increase in cortical thickness in response to later presence training, and the other way around. So whether or not you start with the affective training first or the presence training, you will get that bounce, the bang for the buck of the attentional training, whether or not you start with it or you do it in round 2. And here you have the affective cluster, and you see the increase in cortical thickness as well. Okay then, so training of present moment focused attention leads to increase in cortical thickness in prefrontal regions. Socioaffective training induced plasticity in frontoinsular regions, and sociocognitive training includes changes in the inferior frontal and lateral temporal cortices, fairly much as predicted by the group before they set out with this ambitious protocol. Here are some references which will be included in the file that you can access under the presentation tab. So here again is the overall training effect. You can see increases here in these areas in training group 1 and 2, whereas the controls, the innocent bystanders, experience a decrease in cortical thickness in the 9 months that this protocol was running. Similar here, we, I think, looked at this slide already. Here's another summary of the different findings. You can look at those at your leisure. Now, the group also developed some behavioral measures. So how can we measure attention? So I will not go into detail now as to how the group did this. It's included in the paper, of course. But you can develop a measure and you can see, does this measure of enhanced attention correlate with the increased cortical thickness associated with that training? And indeed, you can see the attentional change correlates well with the change in cortical thickness. Likewise for the theory of mind improvement and the compassion changes here. So this is what you would predict, that to the extent that you improve your behavioral skills, you would anticipate an increase in neuronal plasticity in those brain regions that support these skills. Okay, so that is the end of this presentation. The next talk in this series will be dealing with the effect on stress. The group in Leipzig produced horrendous mental stress by having people give a presentation to a very critical audience and have them do a math test after that, where the experimenter asked them to perform the calculations faster and faster. Almost everybody experiences great stress when exposed to this kind of manipulation. Cortisol, stress hormone, tends to rise, and in the next presentation I will tell you what happens when you contrast meditators to non-meditators in their resilience and ability to deal with sustained stress. That's the end of this presentation, and we'll see you soon again at Behavioral Health 2000.